So thank you all for being here. And that's a good reminder to me to tell you all that we are recording this event. So if you're not comfortable with that, go ahead, turn your camera off or change your name, whatever makes you feel comfortable. And the recording is going to be on YouTube. So if you need to share it with someone or go back and see something, that will be an option. And then we also do have ASL interpretation. You can probably see Sarah there. So look for their picture. And also I think another Hannah is going to be trading off with Sarah. So look for them if that's something you need. And then this event, we're going to have some speakers at the beginning, and then there also will be time at the end for Q&A. So if at any point during this panel, you think of a question you'd like to ask, go ahead, and I think you'll be able to DM someone in the DMs that is called questions, and that person will facilitate getting those questions to our panelists. And then just keep in mind that we are going to be discussing some events that could be triggering for survivors. So as you're composing your questions, just be mindful of that, try to be respectful. Okay, I'm just going to say a couple more things before we get started. We want to first acknowledge that the Portland DSA operates on traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlimit, and Clackamas bands of Chinookan people, the Tualatin Kalapuya, the Molalla, and the Molalla. Following several treaties, including the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, these peoples were forcibly removed to reservations throughout Oregon. Today, many of their living descendants are a part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon, while others are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs, the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians, and the Chinook Nation. Many Native Americans from across Oregon and throughout the United States have relocated here, representing over 380 tribes, and are part of an active and engaged intertribal community. And we know that we have panelists and potentially attendees here from across the country. So we're going to post a link in the chat to the Native Land website, which is a really great resource to find out whose land you are on. And then you can go and support Indigenous communities and rights and initiatives wherever you're at. So to go and check that out. Okay, so today we're going to be hearing from DSA organizers from Louisiana, Texas, and Oregon, who will share their experiences in mutual aid efforts during climate-fueled catastrophe. As we all know, climate change is not a future problem. It's something that's affecting us now. We all remember the storms in the winter of 2021, which caused prolonged power outages and suffering in both Texas and Oregon. The hurricanes Laura and Ida also affected the power grid in the communities in the Southeast. And on the West Coast over the past couple of years, we've been having these record-breaking wildfires. Sometimes these are caused by poorly maintained power lines. And whatever the cause, they spread rapidly under the hot, dry conditions caused by climate change. And the fallout from these events, such as extreme heat and cold, lack of power, poor air quality, all that disproportionately affects people experiencing injustices like hunger, poverty, racism, and houselessness. And the response of the state in those instances was neither swift nor comprehensive in alleviating suffering. So mutual aid groups, including those within DSA, stepped into the void during these catastrophes and supported their communities. And some of those organizers are the people we're going to be hearing from today. So John, Rui, Gumbo, and Mitch are all going to speak to how we as socialists can work in solidarity with our communities. And they're going to discuss what is needed long-term to meet the climate crisis. But before we hear from those four, we are going to hear from Ashley Dawson, our keynote speaker. So I'm going to go ahead and do a brief introduction for him, and then he'll take it away. Ashley's a professor of post-colonial studies in the English department at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and the College of Staten Island. His latest books include People's Power, Reclaiming the Energy Commons, Extreme Cities, The Peril and Promise of Urban Life in the Age of Climate Change, and Extinction, A Radical History. An anti-pipeline activist with the No North Brooklyn Pipeline campaign, a member of Public Power New York, and the founder of the CUNY Climate Action Lab, he is a longtime climate justice activist. He is currently at work on a book entitled Environmentalism from Below, and is co-editing a volume called Decolonize Conservation. And we'll give links to all of those resources in the chat. Ashley will be talking to us about the history and current state of our electrical grid and how that relates to resiliency in the face of climate change. So Ashley, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Really good to be here. I also want to thank Serena and Mitch for helping make today's event possible, and also everybody else, including the ASL interpreter, Sarah, who is helping to make this event accessible and resonant for everyone out there. It's great to be with you. So I only have 15 minutes. I'm going to really try to stick to that. I have a lot of information to try and share with you, so I will be going fairly quickly through this, but of course, I'd be very happy to answer any questions which may be left dangling during the question and answer session. Okay, so my presentation is how to fight fossil capitalism. There are going to be 3 parts to the presentation. First, why we must fight fossil capitalism. Second, historical precedents for public power. And then last of all, how to beat fossil capitalism. Okay, so part 1, why we gotta fight. Okay, you all will probably remember the report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from 2018, one of the most sort of forthright of their reports, saying that we have to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees and have to do that by rapid and far-reaching transitions in land, energy, industry, buildings, et cetera, et cetera. And that means that global net human-caused emissions of CO2 have to fall by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, reaching net zero around 2050. And obviously that kind of idea of net zero itself is not only complicated, but also controversial because it has led to a lot of kind of green capitalist solutions. But nonetheless, pretty dire warning about the extent of the climate emergency. And you know, one of the last big things that they pointed out was that all of this means that any remaining emissions would need to be balanced by removing CO2 from the air. Now, just to give you a kind of graphic idea of the situation, the bubble in blue shows the remaining carbon budget, 565 billion tons of CO2 versus the carbon bubble based on emissions from burning all known reserves of coal, oil, and gas. So we're faced with a situation where we can't burn everything that we know about. And in addition to that, we have to stop exploring for further resources and extracting them. What does the picture look like within the United States? Well, not so great, right? Fossil fuels account for about 65%. We have a very aged nuclear fleet that constitutes about 20%. Many of those reactors are beyond their decommission date. And then there's about 15% generation by so-called renewables. But as you can see from this graphic, a significant proportion of that is from hydro. And whether hydro is actually renewable or not is itself controversial. Dams generate a lot of methane from the vegetation that rots inside the catchment areas. And you know, there are many other reasons that hydro is controversial, including the ways in which it displaces people. So the actual so-called modern renewables like wind, solar, and geothermal are actually a very small quantity and percentage of electricity generation in the US, despite decades of warnings about the need to shift away from fossil fuels. The picture is equally alarming on a global scale. As you can see here, there have been increasing amounts of generation by renewables. This is a story you hear a lot in the media, you know, the very fast uptake of solar in particular makes many mainstream commentators feel quite optimistic. But you can also see that on a global scale, natural gas and coal have also been growing really, really significantly. Okay. And all of this also has an ideological level. So we, of course, remember Trump and his America First energy policy, and the person on the right is Bolsonaro, happily grinning while he burns down the Amazon rainforest with the kind of idea that every Brazilian has a right to expand into that frontier. Of course, to the destruction of the rainforest and the indigenous peoples and other forest-dwelling peoples who live therein. Extractivist populism hasn't gone away despite the fact that Trump lost power. And of course, I'm sure we're all very, very aware that things look quite bleak politically for progressive forces in the United States in the not too distant future. So we're likely to see a return of extractivist populism on the federal scale. And of course, it has never gone away on other scales. Okay, part two. Historical precedents for public power. It's good to look back and think about the ways in which there are histories of resistance to the dire trends which I just tracked. We need to be able to draw on those histories as we fight for better futures, I would argue. So if we go back way to the beginning of the modern electrical grid in the United States, we find figures like Richard Ely, an economist, who argued that while it might be necessary to have a natural monopoly in cities, and what he meant by natural monopolies was that it made sense to only have one utility providing water or one utility providing power, rather than a bunch of companies competing against one another, which was the situation when generation was first being set up of electricity and water and other utilities. So he argued that maybe it makes sense to have just one company be a natural monopoly, but if these natural monopolies were left in the hands of private corporations, he argued they will throttle their customers with exorbitant rates. He was arguing that right at the end of the 19th century. So you can see that in the progressive era, as the modern grid was being set up, there was already a lot of popular discontent and a lot of challenges to private power. This is Gifford Pinchot, a very famous environmentalist, but also briefly the governor of Pennsylvania, who argued for something called giant power. And this was basically to wire everyone in the state of Pennsylvania with to the electrical grid and provide power for everybody. This is a copy of the front page of his report, the report of the Giant Power Survey Board. And what he said, this is a short quotation from that report. He said, "The situation is almost magical in its boundless possibilities for good or evil. On the good side, it is as though a beneficent power were about to shower upon us gifts of unimaginable beauty and worth." So the kind of promise of ameliorating life that electrification held for people. But on the bad side, he said, it is as though an enchanted evil spider were hastening to spread his web over the whole of the United States and to control and live upon the life of our people. So a very kind of powerful image of corporate power and corporate monopoly as a almost kind of vampiric spider sucking the lifeblood of the people of the country. Not that much after Pinchot wrote, in the mid-1930s, in the context of the New Deal, the journalist Valdemar Kempfert, who wrote for the New York Times, he was their science correspondent, wrote about the prospect of electrification of rural areas and the necessity of doing that. And his comments, again, were quite critical about private power companies. He said they are not philanthropic institutions. Investors look to them for dividends. If there's no market in a sparsely populated territory, it is ruinous to electrify it. The profit motive must be subordinated to the obvious social duty of spreading the use of electricity. So a kind of really important perspective there, that private enterprises were not going to actually bring power to the majority of people in the United States, that the public interest had to be foremost rather than private enterprise. And interestingly, in the rest of that quotation, he compares the United States system of liberal capitalist democracy to a fascist or a communist state. Remember, this is the mid-1930s when he's writing. And he's sort of saying, you know, the United States system might be outmoded in comparison to fascism or communism, because those two systems can just have a government which decides to hook everybody up and issue an edict, and it all happens. So, you know, it's important to look back to the 30s and remember that people back then were questioning the viability of the American system of government based on its perceived infrastructural failures, its failures to meet the social and environmental challenges of the day. One of the important initiatives that came out of this criticism and out of the social movements that were helping to articulate criticism of private corporate electrical power at the time was the Rural Electrification Administration. And what this was basically an initiative from FDR and the federal government that gave low interest loans to co-ops that people in rural areas set up. So, you know, I think the rhetoric here in this ad for the REA is really interesting, right? At the bottom, you see REA, co-ops are member-owned and controlled. So there's this very strong effort to emphasize energy democracy, or what we would today call energy democracy, the fact that people could form co-ops, that they got to have a voice in them, they got to make decisions about where the wires were strung up, you know, how much it all cost, what kinds of loans to take out, et cetera, et cetera. So this prospect of using federal power, using federal grants, and empowering people in terms of their capacity to make decisions for themselves, as well as just getting hooked up to the electrical grid. I want to draw your attention to one other moment in the past. This is an essay from the New York Times, an op-ed piece called Resiliency and Energy Strategy by the physicist Amory Lovins, who is the founder of the Rocky Mountain Institute. He was writing in 1977 after a big power outage in New York City. And he wrote that we have developed a society where all the basic functions of modern life depend on electricity. And interestingly, he talked about how centralized electrification, in other words, you know, having a central power generating facility with wires strung out to people in their homes, have actually magnified the brittleness of people's lives and their dependency on these kinds of very complex electrical systems, which are meant to withstand most crises. But as he says in the third paragraph, rare events happen. The totalitarian law of physics states that whatever is not forbidden is compulsory. In other words, the possibly rare events are infinitely numerous, so we live in a world full of nasty surprises. And in the final paragraph that I quote, he asks, can New Yorkers who will want electricity for a long time to come evolve the kind of electrical system that is more resilient, less vulnerable, less susceptible to catastrophic failures than the kind we have been building? And he answers that question by saying, I believe they can, and that this carries a broad lesson for our energy policy to avoid too much centralization and complexity. We cannot afford failures on such a large scale, so we should reduce the scale. And remember, this is in 1977, so he's already saying the same kind of thing that people today are saying, but the availability of renewable energies and the absolute necessity of shifting into renewable energy because of the climate emergency only make his words seem more important and more prescient. Okay, my final portion is called How to Beat Fossil Capitalism, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the struggles on the ground here in New York City. So this is a kind of overview nationally where most Americans get their money, and you can see almost 70%, sorry, not where people get their money, where they get their power. You can see that about 70% of people get energy from investor-owned utilities or corporate utilities. And so it's very important that we take on investor-owned utilities in New York City. Con Ed and National Grid are two of the most important ones. And despite the fact that politicians in our state have been talking about shifting to renewables, right? And Andrew Cuomo's plan to make the shift got a lot of attention. It was called REV, and a lot of kind of capital, social capital and political capital was earned by him for proposing the changes. But if you look at what actually has been happening, you see that the amount of methane gas used in the state has been increasing really significantly. And, solar and wind are still a tiny percentage of the power we use. And in fact, things have been getting worse because of the retirement of some of our nuclear power, which has meant that the percentage of renewables, so-called renewables in the grid is actually going down, and we're consuming more fossil fuels. Those fossil capitalist infrastructures are almost always located in communities of color, such as North Brooklyn. So as Hannah mentioned at the outset, I've been involved in struggles by communities in North Brooklyn against a frack gas pipeline, which National Grid, the utility that provides gas in the city, is setting up there. You can see some of the pipes there. And this is some of the artwork produced by the movement. Really powerful artwork that has been used to mobilize people in the community and also to make connections to struggles in other historical moments and in other parts of the country, right? So this image, I think, brings up the idea of the sacrifice zone and the history of nuclear radiation, the way that particularly indigenous communities were subjected to various forms of nuclear experimentation and exposure in the United States and in Pacific Island territories that the US had occupied. So, seeing those kinds of connections and arguing that we should fight against the pipeline as part of a decolonial struggle was a really important element of the movement. And you can see that again coming up here in the image, in another image from the fight, where the pipeline going through North Brooklyn neighborhoods like Bushwick, Bed-Stuy, and Greenpoint is depicted as a black snake, which is an evocative image of the pipeline, but also, of course, helps to connect to the struggle in Standing Rock against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And you see a quotation here from LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, one of the indigenous water protectors who was key to the No DAPL movement, about the black snake and how we mean to fight against it and kill it. And you can see at one of the protests in North Brooklyn, the way that those images were used with a pipeline being put down. This is a bicycle protest where we rode from place to place in the community. A lot of amazing research was done, and folks found out that the fire department had the right to grant permits or to deny permits to National Grid to lay down the pipeline because they were the ones who would have to put out any fires that should result. So the bike ride went from one fire station to the next to petition the firefighters to deny those permits. But at this point of the demonstration, we were in front of a city bank. Citibank, of course, being one of the big economic sponsors of pipelines across the country. And the protesters were from the Indigenous Kinship Collective, some of whom had been up at Line 3 in Minnesota protesting against a pipeline there. So the kinds of connections between struggles against environmental racism and colonization within New York City and struggles in other parts of the country and in other parts of the world against neocolonialism and fossil capitalism being made. And the last thing I want to touch on is the way in which if those kind of instances of urban blockadia that I've just walked you through, the struggle against the pipeline in North Brooklyn are a kind of no. In addition, we're also advancing a kind of yes, a kind of set of positive alternatives, and that comes in the form of the struggle for public power. So we have some legislation in front of the New York State Legislature to create a public entity, which would be an alternative to the private fossil capitalist corporations, and which would be democratically controlled, as well as not based on generating energy through burning fossil fuels. So I think it's really important to have that no and yes operating in tandem in the struggle. There's a lot more to say, as I said, but I'll wrap up now and give space to other folks. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm really looking forward to being in dialogue with all of you.
Thank you so much, Ashley. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm just going to briefly introduce our other panelists so they can give some opening statements, and then we're going to move into the Q&A portion of the event. So first up is Rui Martinez. Rui is an organizer with Austin DSA as the co-chair of the Electoral Committee and previously worked with Harvard College YDSA as its co-chair. Rui worked on the Heidi Sloan for Congress and Jabari Brisport for state Senate campaigns in 2020. He currently works as a tenant organizer with BASTA, Building and Strengthening Tenant Action, and he is a member of the Reform and Revolution Caucus of DSA. So Rui, your opening remarks.
Lovely. Thank you guys so much. I have a bit of a cold, so I'm going to try to be efficient with my words. So I think I'm going to start with this theme here of I want to tell you guys about how what happened in Texas last year happened and why it happened the way it did. So the first thing is, how does Texas Energy work? Well, Texas Energy is on a separate interconnect. They're a separate, this gets really complicated, but basically Texas is in its own grid. And the way it works is that the managing nonprofit called ERCOT is essentially an air traffic controller rather than an actual energy corporation. It manages the way energy gets to places, but it does not own the energy. It charges for use on the network. It operates basically a free market. And municipalities then take that energy and give it to you. And most municipalities or most areas have like cooperatives or public ownership, which is like good. But if you're out in the countryside and you're taking it straight from whatever company is providing, you are subject essentially to the whims of the market. And ERCOT, so I don't know if I can like share my screen or something, but I've prepared a few things. Can I? Let's try here. Okay, yes. You can see all my other tabs, but I want you to look at this. Missteps, mismanagement, and broken deadlines. New ERCOT reports detail history of organization that oversees the Texas power grid. Now, you would think this would be released in 2021 after the storm. Not so, my friends. It is 2011. Actually, since around 2002 or 3, there have been numerous issues with the power grid. And people have been trying to get some oversight over it, but it's just not been happening. So ERCOT is supposed to manage this. It's supposed to have this sort of incredibly important role as facilitator of energy going around, and it's been messed up for years, for decades. Here we see a New York Times article discussing how it's been set up for disaster. And the way it works, to summarize, is that it operates a free market model with the energy. So the energy is priced to the municipalities or to whoever is giving it directly to you on a free market basis. So let's say there's a power outage, a massive power outage, massive lack of ability to get stuff out. If the supply is low and the demand is high, the price will skyrocket. And people were experiencing prices up to around like $9,000 per kilowatt hour. Now, luckily, in Austin, we had a municipally owned energy company, and they actually took the cost, these obscene costs. But that does not always happen. So the grid, frankly, has just been left to dry. It has had numerous repair issues since 2011, since the first time we saw snow in a long time here in Texas, and no one's really done anything about it. Now, you want to see here, in 2021, this was the share of energy in megawatt hours, or million watt hours, right? In 2020. And so this is still relatively accurate, although the wind is going to go down. The wind was about 23%, 11% was nuclear, 2% was solar, and then you have around, I'll just say like 60% was coal and natural gas, just to say oil. Now, when, very sorry, when the storm happened, it was actually the wind turbines and the renewable energy that had fared the best. Reason why was because ERCOT was quite literally, I mean, the oil and the gas and the pipes were freezing in the cold. It was just not working. So, and of course, the turbines also had a decrease in energy, but it was not nearly as much. And I think that's very positive for us because we can point to, despite the propaganda blitz that happened afterwards, decrying renewable energy, what we can do is we can actually discuss about how this is simply not true and how the energy that worked was the renewable energy. So renewable energy is not only a moral good, it is like a utilitarian good. Like it is simply good. It's better than fossil fuel. It's more reliable. Now, regarding the cold snap, yes. So 1 year ago, in around, I would probably say, can't remember the exact date, but it's in early February. We had a very dramatic drop caused by a cold front coming down. The temperatures reached around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, I think, and we were stuck under snow for around a week and a half. It was pretty dire. In Texas, in Austin, now you have to understand our houses are not built for insulation in the same way y'all's houses in Oregon are not built for, say, like the heat when the heat wave happened, right? So when this hit us, many people's houses dropped to around 40, 30 degrees. I believe some people in Houston died due to the cold. I mean, they simply, if you didn't have some way to warm yourself, you were in trouble because you were stuck in 40 to 30 degree temperatures for around 1 to 3 days. That's dire. And as this happened, right, the price gouging was occurring at the behest of the government. It was by design. It was not a bug. It was a feature. The idea was that this was based on a free market system. In a free market system, during crisis, things will reach crisis prices. So I think the takeaways here are, first of all, about a little bit about ERCOT, is that, I mean, the situation simply is that this sort of independent energy system, this sort of like obsession with the free market, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It simply does not. The other thing here is that, you know, when these things fail, there are real consequences to people. People can get hurt, people can die, people's houses were completely destroyed, pipes were burst due to the changing pressure. And that caused a lot of people massive amounts of damage, people living in apartments. The damage still has not been repaired by greedy landlords, right? So all of this compounds these infrastructure crises, and the reason why Professor Dawson was discussing them so much, these are not just crises of the road. These are crises of like how you live. Infrastructure includes the houses, includes the way you get water, it includes the way you get energy. And when infrastructure fails, basically the fabric, the interconnection of society starts falling apart. You become isolated. So I think it is the cause of socialists to say we are for good infrastructure, we are for the good roads, for the more capable energy systems. We are for the better situation to where you can get to where you need to go. That's transit, that's water, that's gas, whatever the heck you need to like live your life. I think that is the job of socialists. So I think I'm going to end it there. I'll speak briefly. In DSA, we did mutual aid. We did some community outreach. It was quite dangerous, I will just say, because again, no salting on the roads, right? No salt on the roads because we're not used to that. We don't prepare buckets of salt for climate change disasters. So the driving on the roads was extremely dangerous. It was not recommended you do so unless it was an emergency. And several people did actually get hurt. Trying to distribute aid, they would like trip on the icy, on the icy roads. Their cars would swerve. So a lot of what we did was wait for FEMA. Now, several elected officials did step up above and beyond. They were distributing supplies in certain places, warming areas. That made a big difference, I think. And that also really raised that profile of those socialists, or I guess I don't know how socialist they are now, elected officials like Greg Casar. And I think for all that can be critiqued about him, it was good that he, saw his role as an elected to help his community. So all of that being said, I hope I've given a bit of information as to Texas. I'm going to stop speaking now because my nose is very clogged and my throat is very sore, but I hope that was helpful.
Thank you so much, Rui. Next, we're going to hear from John. I'm so sorry. Yes. Yes, we're going to hear from John. John is a member of the Louisiana DSA, Mutual Aid Disaster Relief, and Cooperation Rouge. He has been working with communities in the Deep South and Gulf Coast for the last 12 years with various campaigns, organizations, and disaster response. He holds a master's in public administration with focuses in public health and policy, and he uses what he learned there to research current issues, public and community solutions, and the impacts of historical decisions on current issues of geography. So go ahead, John.
Hey, good evening, all of y'all. Good to see y'all here, and thank y'all to the people who have come before me and the people who will follow me shortly. Just as we just heard a lot about Texas's situation and the things that happened there, I'm going to talk about Louisiana and our hurricanes that we've had over the last 2 years and the last, I'd say 16 to, it's February now, 18-ish months. We've had two of the most powerful hurricanes that have ever made landfall in Louisiana or in the country make landfall. This was Hurricane Laura and Hurricane Ida. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Hurricane Ida, some of the responses, some of the things that led up to it, and how, and also building on what Ashley was bringing up before about the issues of pretty much capitalists controlling all of our utilities. And I also introduce a public utility solution that we have here in Louisiana that's been around for about 125 years. So I'll share my screen and I'll just talk over these images as I kind of walk y'all through them. This is an image of Hurricane Ida. You should be able to see it on your screen, right? Just want to make sure y'all can see it. Okay, good. So yeah, it's actually really beautiful. You can probably see a small, tiny bit of Louisiana up there in the upper left-hand corner, but this is it as it was had already made landfall, and the entire area is enveloped by this. This was a massive natural event, and that's something that has been shaping our organizing for some time here. I'm pretty sure a lot of people have heard about Hurricane Katrina. We deal with regular storms, floods, and including the snap freezes that Texas also dealt with last year too. It's one of those things where it kind of shapes the way that we go about doing things and the way that we try to look at doing things. However, as we know, as proper eco-socialist, capitalism always gets in the way. So this is the path that it took through Louisiana. It unfortunately skirted major metropolitan areas, but it also luckily did. It's still with the places that it made landfall, like Grand Isle, or just now getting back to creation and just now getting back into running and flowing. Some of those places were unfortunately completely destroyed. I lived, the original path forward actually was going directly over my home. As you can see here, this is a percentage of customers in Louisiana who lost power. We have a pretty much an energy monopoly underneath a company called Entergy, coincidentally, here in Louisiana, and they control our entire power network for our entire state. This catastrophic event that they promised us and continually said, oh yes, like we have made adjustments that will make sure that people are not suffering or that the power is not out, and that the things that are needed for both emergency response, healthcare, nursing homes, hospitals, and other things of that nature. And remind you, we're still in a pandemic also during this point as well. So making sure that all of these things are still operable during a hurricane and that we've been bolstering the system. As you can see here, that with the amount of areas that were 100% out and upwards of 80% out, this was not true. The timeline for power outages for everybody to the eastern side of the Mississippi River was greater than 7 to 8 days, in some cases upwards of 30 days, and unfortunately in some places as far out as 4 to 6 months. Some places are have just now started getting the lights back on. This is another thing that I'm going to use to build out and talk a little bit more about the grid system. So this is Entergy's service area and maps of which they show their power lines, power distribution connectors, and other things of that nature. And the key thing about this is that all of these these are all of the different power systems for different cities, towns, villages, and other places within South Louisiana. And as you can see, there is a massive amount of red here. And the problem with this is that we have a centralized network. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this as well. But a key thing about a centralized network is that essentially, if we lose connection to any of the major power sources that are feeding power into our area, then we inevitably end up losing the power that they said that they were going to do. Now then, capitalists have a direct benefit in doing this and not trying to make adjustments to the system because the heavy capital investment costs, other things of that nature. It just makes sense to it makes sense for them from an investment standpoint, not from a sustainable standpoint, not from a reaction to our current condition standpoint in relation to Entergy, to not keep this, to essentially not update those systems, but promise that their centralized network would work better. As you can see here, that is not true. And I'll also pass on to note that this is a common scene in South Louisiana. As you can see, there is literally a plant right here up against this neighborhood. And you can see that these people's homes are pretty much largely inhabitable in some cases. Some are raised up, many are flooded, and the plants are still going in the background. I'm going to show you another image here. The plants are lit up, they have light. This is another scene from somebody taking a picture from across the other side of the fence where houses are at, where people live at, and they can see that the plant is still on even as the power is out, and everything else is shut down in our area. This is just one of those examples of how, just as was mentioned, where certain places and things will be given priority infrastructure and other things of that nature as well. Now, this also applies to us as well, because alongside Entergy, even though they promised to install a new gasoline plant, this is important for Louisiana because Louisiana has one of the largest oil refineries on the continent here, actually one of the largest in the world, right here north of our state capital. And unfortunately, even when it came time for them to turn on those gas plants as part of this centralized network, that never actually manifested. And we also ended up with gas shortages. These gas shortages were highly, highly important, not because people were needing to go to work or move around, but because the problem is that we were in the middle of a heat wave. It got up to 93 degrees at night inside. The heat wave actually, unfortunately, caused more death for people than other situations. And as I mentioned, because there was no gas that was available to be distributed or given to people to try to at least amend or act as a safety net for our centralized grid's failure. So we ended up with a lot of issues and problems. My family had to evacuate our home during this time period as well. And this is the last thing I'm going to talk about when it comes to centralized grids. That massive tower that you see right there, you may have seen in movies or other places, or if you watched Spider-Man No Way Home when he was fighting Electro, those are main power transmission lines, and they are massive. They feed power into areas as part of a centralized grid. And this hurricane winds was so strong that they destroyed these. And this is a heavy part of why we're dealing with this for so long. Now, the solutions that people are now pushing back against on Entergy for, and because they are a monopoly company, are microgrids. Louisiana is a prime area for solar power, wind power, and microgrids also just make sense. And when we look at other places that deal with category 4 and 5 hurricanes on an annual basis as we do, like Puerto Rico, they've started rolling out these distributed grids and microgrids using renewable energy to protect themselves and keep the necessities on that people need as these things are going on. And finally, another thing that we kind of ended up building out of this was we used some wood from things that was destroyed during the storm to stand up a community fridge during this time period, to also provide food and water to other folks during these things, and clothes as well during the most recent cold snap. And I'll also transition here and talk a little bit about what a public utility option looks like, because we have a 125-year-old public utility system right here in Louisiana. It started off providing plumbing. They provide various things. They do not provide power yet, but I would love to see this happen and love to see this expand. LUS, or the Lafayette Utility System, has the model for a public utility. We have it right here in our own state. So it is highly possible that it is highly possible and doable that these things could be municipalized or statized, as we jokingly call it, when you talk about nationalizing a different utility company. And I believe that is all I have for right now, but I just wanted to walk y'all through that and share some things. Looking forward to more questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, John. That was wonderful. Next, we're going to hear from Gumbo. Gumbo is a member of Austin DSA and Mutual Aid Disaster Relief. Originally from New Orleans, they earned a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering and another in political science from Louisiana Tech University. While there, they organized a YDSA chapter that provided a weekly meal program to around 20 to 30 people and participated in physical relief efforts after Hurricane Laura in 2020. They moved to Austin 3 weeks before Hurricane Ida, whereafter they set up an MADR supply hub with 2 other DSA comrades to collect and run supplies into South Louisiana along the MADR supply line. And currently they work for Austin Transportation on JS projects and parking programs, bringing a socialist worldview to engineering and city governance. So go ahead, Gumbo.
Yeah, hello. Shabbat Shalom, comrades. I'm Gumbo, they, them pronouns, calling from Carrizo Camacrudo land in Austin, Texas. I think political silence is what they call it when they take away voting rights. Political science is the degree though. But yeah, after John's description of power outages after Ida and like the precarity of the whole centralized Louisiana energy system, I kind of wanted to talk about how Louisiana approaches the aftermath of a disaster. There's a really good disasterologist, his name's Wes, he's also in DSA, and he says not to call them natural disasters because there's nothing natural about when a disaster happens. It's man-made what actually happens when a climate event strikes. But I remember after Hurricane Laura, just 1 year prior to Ida, to the day, both of them on the anniversary of Katrina, which is really fun, there were nearly 1 million people affected by power outages. Part of that is because we don't get hurricanes that stay a Category 1 hurricane until they reach the Arkansas border. And a lot of it is because Louisiana's infrastructure is centered around extraction, as John showed those pictures. But that's almost a quarter of the state that was offline for, in some cases on the better end in Ruston where I was at, 4 to 5 days. Boil advisories always come after those power outages. In some places like Lake Charles where the eye hit, they were out for weeks and months. And Lake Charles, if you drive down it now, they still have tarps on their roofs. They have tarps that have been there since 2020. They have tarps that have had to be replaced because they've worn through. And those same people who have ruined roofs were hit by the same freeze that Austin and Houston were hit by, but they didn't have homes. And you know, they didn't have the sad side effect of having the centralized Texas grid. So they had power, but they didn't have a roof. They were still cold. And another problem is DSA doesn't really have a foothold outside of the major centers and the major urban centers in Louisiana, those being New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Lafayette. And really New Orleans is the only one that's any kind of powerful or entrenched in any sort of way. And Baton Rouge and Lafayette, a little bit less so, but much better than the rural areas. But there's vast swaths of rural Louisiana that are just loosely connected to anything else at all, maybe not connected. They're predominantly Black, they're overwhelmingly poor, and they are some of the sickest and most cancer-prone places in the country. If you've heard of Cancer Alley, upriver from Baton Rouge, where they have over 100 different processing and oil refinery plants that, you know, people there have higher rates of cancer that are in the double digits more than the rest of the country. So the approach to mutual aid in Louisiana, it's one that it punches above its weight class because it has to, and it's informed by this generational knowledge and trauma that nobody's coming to save us. I mean, when a hurricane starts coming to the Gulf Coast, it's a foregone conclusion that we are on our own. The Coast Guard might come out for search and rescue if the water's bad enough. The National Guard might come in a few days later, and FEMA might just not come. I mean, there's people who live in Lake Charles who have still not gotten financial assistance from the government, and it hit almost 2 years ago. And even when those things come in, there's strings attached. You know, it's equitably rationed. There's no transportation to distribution sites. There's no one really taking it to people who need it. So it's really, if you got a car and you got gas, you can get it. And if you don't, fuck you. Pardon my French. But I mean, there's tax and insurance fine print, and there's the carceral baggage of being in the state with the highest incarceration rate in the world. It is higher than most countries. It is higher than any other state in the United States. And so there's another generational knowledge of people don't want to engage with the state and its auxiliaries because what if they get sent to jail? What if, you know, the police and the National Guard come out after these storms, and they're not looking to help people. They're looking to arrest people, to keep the peace, to suppress anything that happens after a disaster. So Louisiana people learned a long time ago that to get the help we need, we got to help each other. That's where mutual aid disaster relief comes from. It grew naturally out of the Common Ground Collective that rose up after Katrina, which itself was informed by the anti-war protests, 2003, 2004. That morphed into Occupy Sandy and eventually MADR in its current iteration around 2016. And they always deploy almost immediately after disaster. I've learned that firsthand. They start looking at these things days before they hit. There are supply lines that are in place, and as soon as the roads are clear, people are out and moving. They've got chainsaws, they've got cars and trucks full of like diapers, water, food, non-perishables, anything people need to actually get survivability. And it's really when we start helping ourselves that the needles start to move on outside aid coming in. We have to almost demonstrate that we are worthy or needing of this aid before any other people start to look at us. And that whole pattern really informs the call for a Louisiana statewide DSA chapter, which there are only a couple statewide chapters in the country. I'm not directly involved with this anymore because I moved to Texas, but I do stay in touch. We call it the Louisiana diaspora, of people who have kind of been forced out of Louisiana, either intentionally or unintentionally displaced by disasters. If you want to know more about that, there's a really good book called it's about life in the Katrina diaspora. The main title is Displaced. But the core problem is that outside of NOLA, these individual DSA chapters are small and overworked and very well connected to each other or to the rural areas. And when a disaster hits, people get displaced so easily that it disrupts any kind of long-term organizing, because you build and you build and you build, and then something beyond your control happens, and suddenly you've got to start all over 100 miles down the road. In North Louisiana, most of the DSA people are college students. Shout out to David and Kay, I think are here from my old YDSA chapter. There's no DSA local for 200 miles in any direction from Ruston, Louisiana. So all these at-large members in rural areas in Louisiana, there's no clear path to membership or engagement. And the idea kind of started to bubble up that we needed a bigger grouping, a bigger formation to address these natural disasters, these climate disasters as they happen, and pool together what normally are disparate resources into a centralized formation that can actually address these problems with more of a combined might than we could disconnectedly. So yeah, really that's just a slice of what it's like, living on what is, for all intents and purposes, a frontline community in the climate change era. And it's hard. That's all I got to say. Sorry I didn't have slides to show y'all. You had to look at my pretty face this whole time, but yeah.
Oh, that was wonderful, Gumbo. Thank you so much. Lastly, I'm going to introduce Mitch Green. Mitch is a member of Portland DSA and organizes with the Resiliency Working Group. Mitch has been active in some mutual aid and resiliency projects in the Portland area centered around wildfire displacement and resiliency, winter ops that include clearing sidewalks and felled tree limbs, and other broad themes around community resiliency. He holds a PhD in economics and will sometimes write and teach on topics ranging from political economy to monetary theory and policy. And right now he's mostly thinking about the infrastructure requirements of a care economy. So go ahead, Mitch.
Thanks, Hannah. Before I get into the specific work and projects Resiliency Working Group does in Portland, I'd like to set up how we think about our work in this working group more broadly. So the working group was established in May of 2019 with the intention of building deep and enduring relationships that center not just mutual aid, although that's obviously really prominent and very important, but also this idea that we're weaving together structures capable of serving as a bulwark to the crises of capitalism and climate change and all that interconnectedness. Hence the name resiliency. So this should be familiar to anyone that has spent any time in anti-fascist organizing spaces or protest spaces. because it echoes that slogan you often hear, quote, "We protect us." And I picked up a little bit of that from Gumbo's talk, which is this idea, that effective community defense requires solidarity, but it extends more broadly to economic institutions of care. So let's talk a bit about what I mean by that. So since we formed, we've done a lot of different stuff, and really too much to list here in depth. But some highlights are as follows. So top of the list, we responded to some of the crises of 2020. So we built do-it-yourself respirators to protect protesters from chemical attacks by the police and other agents of the state. We built and distributed DIY air filtration systems for the very, very bad wildfire smoke that came later that summer. Oregon's also in an extractive zone, but primarily like timber and fish. And so we're living through the consequences of really bad forestry practices. And we've got a little link in there to a forestry webinar if you want to check that out later. And so heading into the winter, we had a pretty bad cold snap as well in winter of 2021 that caused a lot of down limbs and power outages around the city. So we formed a group called DSA Lumberjacks and went around clearing these limbs. We bought some chainsaws and sectioned off the wood, but then we brought it back to a location to season with the intention of like plugging that into future supply lines. So everything is, we're trying to think holistically around this process. And so since then, we've distributed some of that wood to our houseless neighbors in town that need it for heating and cooking fuel. And we intend to keep doing that. We bought some snow shovels and have organized a little team that is ready to respond in the event that snow shuts our city down, which is kind of a joke for us in Portland because like an inch of snow will shut the city down. But it's literally because the city lacks the municipal infrastructure to clear the streets. So people are stuck sometimes for a week. And so it's very real consequences. And it's kind of it's the tip of the iceberg for a lot of like lack of infrastructure problems in this city. So you can see we have these little seasonal thematic response efforts that we can stand up as needed and kind of deploy, which we do planning and organizing work around all year to kind of sustain that. But we also have projects that are related to other crises of capitalism. For example, last year, we organized 1040 Block, which is an effort to help vulnerable Portlanders, most of whom lack housing, file their taxes and take advantage of significant monies owed to them by the state. We're actually still working on getting the IRS to honor those claims, which is another matter entirely, and it's representative of yet another dimension of state violence. So it won't be a surprise, but not all state violence is truncheons and tear gas. It happens in everyday administrative interactions, right? But we think that that's pretty important work. And stay tuned, we're actually preparing to turn the screws on the IRS with the pressure campaign, make some demands that these claims be processed, and we might need support in that. And we're also working in other areas related to food security and childcare, which are longer term projects. Other folks talked about microgrids or kind of distributed energy generation stuff. We've got a project where we're trying to kind of build self-contained kind of mobile charging units that we can deploy to folks who have that need. So I'll wrap here by saying that in our working group, we don't view any of this work as a substitute for other pillars of socialist organizing, but rather we see it as a complement to them and part of the necessary institution building that will give our movement power. So thanks for that consideration.
Thank you, Mitch. All right, so we're going to transition to the question and answer section of the panel, and we're running a little long, but I feel like it was well worth it. Those were wonderful statements. Thank you, everyone. So we're going to spend about 20 minutes on our pre-prepared questions, and then that'll leave us about 10 minutes for any questions that you all have. So again, just make sure to put those in the DM those to the questions person if you have any questions you come up with. Okay, so our first question is going to be for Gumbo. Can you just you talked a little bit about this, but can you maybe talk a little more about specific methods, tactics, and logistical challenges that you've seen mutual aid groups use or face during the climate disaster?
Yeah, I mean, really nothing's off the table. I've been on both ends of it, as I mentioned. There's a certain physical fulfillment to doing the on the ground work. It's the stuff that looks the best on camera. It's the stuff you see people do, like handing out water in the street, like Greg Kassar did with Austin Needs Water, getting out there with a chainsaw. It's the stuff that's dangerous, it's fun, it's exhilarating. Um, there's so much background work that goes into it. And I learned that the hard way after Ida hit. I'd only been in Austin for 3 weeks, and I didn't really have any deep connections beyond Rui and two other folks, Bennett and Jordan, who I'd met online. And I jumped in our Slack and I said, hey, we need to do something. I just got here, but we are in like a safe place where we're far enough inland that our supply chain is not messed up, and people need what we have in abundance somewhere else. And that led to two other people, Dice and Grace, who worked on that Austin Needs Water stuff during the freeze. They helped me set up a warehouse at this like storage facility that someone was renting for a black box theater, and had a great mind for logistics. And we set up a supply hub. We started running donations in. We moved about 14,000 pounds of like water and light goods and other like cleanup supplies, which would not have happened without that mind for logistics. I don't have a background in supply chain management, but I think one thing that DS could really do in a meaningful way to connect kind of the labor struggle that we're constantly involved with the front line of climate change is to connect organized labor with mutual aid efforts. Like if we had teachers to just run that shit because they already, do logistics work for UPS, we could have done it so much easier. So much. I mean, we did it with like a skeleton crew, and we did it under a day that we got it set up, but we should have had prepared already. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges, is just that economy of scale of actually providing aid, because it's something that you would think the government should just be doing, and they're not. And they don't do it until we start to do it and they see that their legitimacy is threatened. So that presents almost a golden opportunity when these things happen to subvert the norm and show people that a better way and a better world is possible. And that only happens when we light up all sectors of the US left and of DSA and the US in general. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, that's great. And that actually segues really beautifully into our next question, which is for John, which is just how have you seen mutual aid efforts strengthen your community and work towards building trust in socialist organizing?
Okay. Glad to roll off of Gumbo, and I'm going to roll a little bit off of Mitch here, where Mitch mentioned it as a complement to other areas, because I'm going to talk a little bit about how our mutual aid work actually built out some of the other areas of the work that we needed to do in our chapter before the hurricane hit, and also afterwards. So some of the things that I've noticed when it comes to building community trust that comes directly with it is more so that, just like Gumbo said, in which like it does look good, but it also gives us an opportunity to invite people to come and do work with us, to come and get to know us, and to come and do other things with us. So whether it was building the community fridge or setting up the community fridge network locally in Baton Rouge, or doing our food or solidarity or clothing shares, this allowed us to build deeper connections with other groups in the area, because people are going to recognize those needs, right? Like there are more than likely always going to be other groups who are trying to supply food, clothing, other things like that. And these also often, even though I know we don't like staff NGOs, there are often not staff NGOs, just community members that are just out here doing this type of work and trying to support others. So those are great opportunities for us to connect. And this actually led into some people joining DSA, especially in a majority Black city, in one of the blackest states in the country. This led to about half of our new members and people that ended up joining DSA chapters in our area also being people of color and Black, because that's who we were largely working with or inviting to come help with us. This even bred over into some of the local churches or other folks actually asking me to come and talk to them or share a little bit about what our organization is, what DSA is, and talk a little bit about mutual aid, and literally just share anti-capitalist principles. Like they literally text me directly and are like, hey, we really like what you're doing here, and we want to show and we want to highlight this and show this to other people. And this didn't involve like bouncing on any of the ideas or other things like that. If people saw our work, they saw that we were putting some of the things that we talk about into praxis, and they loved that. they absolutely loved it, especially in a place like Gumbo mentioned, where it often is like we're all we got. So we're trying, everybody wants to try to do what they can to help others. And the other side that I'll connect into this is that it also led into some people coming to us and saying, well, hey, like I saw the work that y'all were doing, and I know that like y'all are typically involved in like labor or union efforts. I want to try to organize a union at my school. I want to try to do these things. I want to try to connect with other things like that. And I'm like, okay, just as Mitch mentioned, a compliment. Let me connect you with my friend who's a labor organizer in our local teachers union. Let me help you get inroads there. Let me try to connect. Let me expand this out and use this network or this space that I'm building here, and let's connect you with other efforts here. You know, so it does a good job is that it's directly outwards facing, connecting with other folks, and doing it in a way that is direct and that they can see that we're showing up. And it kind of helps build that trust because they can see it. They can see it, or they can experience it, or they're often doing it alongside us.
Thank you so much, John. Our next question is going to be for Mitch. In many cases, the disaster response work that mutual aid groups do is reacting to a lack of suitable infrastructure. Do you think the work that groups like Resiliency Work Group do is futile in the face of under-provisioning of resources?
That's a really good question, Hannah. And so when we think about infrastructure, I think we need to extend our scope beyond just like steel, concrete, and telephone poles. And the other panelists have hit on this nicely. Infrastructure more broadly is a set of enabling institutions that allow for research production and allow for distribution. And that's economics, right? So I see mutual aid work as having the potential to build its own enabling institutions. For instance, all the networks of logistics and production chains that we do, ranging from DIY air filters to cooperative care. And I think you still need that more traditional definition, but I don't think it's a hard constraint on how we organize. I think being able to act in defiance of those received institutions, particularly the sort of lack of the intentional under provisioning of infrastructure, is what sets us apart from a more liberal response to the problem, right? It helps us build power.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Ashley a question next. How can we create unity at the national level between the various DSA chapters to organize for a nationalized grid? And what do we want to demand if we get a nationalized grid?
Okay, great question. Well, as you saw in one of the slides, really significant numbers of people across the United States get their power from investor-owned utilities. We heard that the United States has a grid which is quite fragmented. There are 3 areas. ERCOT in Texas is one, and there's one basically for the eastern half of the United States and one grid for the western half of the United States, broadly speaking. And then there are lots of kind of variegations within that, with many investor-owned utilities being on a state or regional scale. So there's a lot of fragmentation there in the energy landscape. But the one thing that unites us all is that the vast majority of us are getting screwed over by large capitalist corporations that exist to make money rather than for the public good during a time of climate emergency. In fact, they're exacerbating the climate emergency because they have massive investments in frozen fossil capitalist assets, and they're spending millions of dollars every year lobbying against energy transition, trying to break the unions that workers in that sector have formed. And so I think that ways to make unity across different DSA branches is to share the kind of knowledge about how campaigns for public power play out. Some of the information about how investor-owned utilities take a lot of the money they make from ratepayers. And we know that these utilities are supposed to be publicly regulated. There are public service commissions that are supposed to guarantee affordable rates, but of course they don't. They're completely colonized by the corporate utilities, and the rates are far too high, and poor people can get their electricity cut off at virtually any time. Aside from in the context of a climate disaster like the one that happened in Texas or in Louisiana, just in the kind of daily life, thousands of people are suffering from energy poverty and energy injustice. So we know how these corporations act, and we can provide information to one another about how we research that information, what kinds of strategies we use to mobilize members of the public, what kind of pressure campaigns we mount in our own states to try and get legislators on board with some kind of public alternative, and how to frame that public alternative, right? So should you go for municipalizing the existing corporate utilities, or should you try and build out some kind of complete alternative to those, maybe something along the lines of what John was mentioning, an existing public utility in Louisiana. And that's what we've chosen to do in New York State, right? We have this New Deal era entity called the New York Power Authority. It's mandated to produce a very small amount of power, like for the City University of New York and other university systems, but it can provide power to municipal entities and to private consumers. So we want to change that and build out NYPA to service everyone in the state. So, thinking through those questions, which are questions of political strategy and, also, technical questions, and being able to network with one another around those kinds of issues, I think is really the way to go. And just keep hammering home this basic point that the corporate utilities are failing us. They have failed us. They've been around for a century, and they are in the way of our collective survival, is really important.
Thank you, Ashley. Rui, I'm going to ask you a question next. And you kind of talked about this in your opening statement, but if there's anything you want to add about how the Travis County Public Power alleviated economic devastation during the cold snap, and what the different effects were outside of Travis County, who didn't have access to a public power utility or public power.
Yeah. So in terms of, so basically there's 2 municipally owned power companies in the area. And this is some of the weird redundancy in Texas, is that we have a municipal power and we also have a county power, because they don't overlap, or they do overlap, but not precisely. And a lot of outlying areas in the central Texas area have publicly owned or cooperatively owned energy companies. So they've been able to tank that cost. So when the power crisis happened and ERCOT was charging cities and essentially everyone these ridiculous prices for kilowatt hours, what happened was that the cities took those costs and simply ate them. They got money from the city through taxes, through going into debt, so that people would not bankrupt themselves for turning on their light. I mean, it's crazy, but that's the truth. And I think this shows the importance of municipally owned energy, but also its limitation, right? I think there's a tendency towards localism, and like this idea of, now localism is very different from, say, infrastructure that's built to be localized in the context of disasters, like John was saying. I'm talking more about the idea that we can solve all of these problems locally. And I don't think that's the case, because like companies and cities and municipally owned energy companies cannot just eat costs whenever ERCOT wants to fail its job, right? What needs to happen is a mass movement of socialists needs to organize to change this system and give us ourselves, I hate to say it because it sounds like that like a John Stewart-y thing, but like a rational system. And I think that rational system is a socialist system of publicly owned, major nationalized energy, which we invest a lot into. I think what we're going to do to build that movement is going to require work all over the country. It's going to require electing people, obviously, but also mass unionization to be able to actually do work stoppages to demand things. In South Korea, a very militant set of unions have done a literal general strike demanding for a lot of very important economic reforms to their conglomerate system. So I'm getting a bit off topic here, but my point is that there are ways to mitigate, right, these terrible statewide disasters, but they don't actually resolve the issue. And they can't, right? Because they're dealing at a level of municipalities versus states versus the nation that didn't want to give necessary infrastructural developments in Louisiana, in Puerto Rico, in Texas too, although to a much lesser extent. And also just not acknowledging the reality that we live in a world where climate catastrophe and climate crisis is going to affect us more and more and more. So I think we need to start looking for political resolutions or political ways to manage this. Otherwise, I think we're going to be in for a very rough next 30 years. So that's how it is.
Thank you, Rui. We're running a little long, so I'm going to try and get some of these questions from everyone here. So the first one we have is, in New Jersey, we have a coalition group called Empower New Jersey, ultimate goal of getting a moratorium on all new fossil fuel projects and fighting against individual projects along the way. Does anyone know if any other states have a group like that, or if there is a national group? Do any of our panelists want to speak to that? Well, we'll come back to that. I'm not, I think maybe the answer is no, we don't know. There's another question for Rui. When I think about mutual aid, I think about everyday working people getting what they need to live a dignified life. But at the end of the day, it's workers paying to support other workers while all suffer under capitalism. How do we build to move beyond this? And you kind of touched on that, but anything else to add?
Yeah, so I actually do think, like, and I think there's a weird caricature in socialist spaces that you're like either on the mutual aid side or you're not. But really, I think what we should view mutual aid or disaster aid, which is really what we're describing here, is more like disaster relief, right? Which we would hope the government would do, right? Like in a better world, people would not have to organize themselves to provide resources that come from people who are already, like, we're not the ones who have trillions of dollars. The capitalists do. They're the ones who have the resources to actually provide the real relief more than any group of socialists could. But in their failure, I think sometimes it is necessary, such as in Louisiana, for people to come in and do their best. And I think we have to also acknowledge it as the disaster area expands, that like this work is not the most safe. It can actually be quite dangerous if you're not prepared for the conditions. And that's something that we should really keep in mind. But I think the way we're going to be able to organize that and organize a political response has to be by making outward facing campaigns. So I love this idea that John was talking about, where they would ask people, hey, do you want to help us do this? Do you want to come to this socialist meeting? I think that's the exact right attitude we need to take towards aid, and then turn that into, we all experienced this. This was really bad. We need to change this. We can't literally create a parallel power network to rival what the government could. So we need to take power over that and try to change. That's just my opinion, at least. And that's a very effective way. I think we could transition that energy towards another goal. Maybe we couldn't reach everyone. Maybe people couldn't reach us. And so a way that we could go forward is talk to people at their door about, did you experience this? When I worked in tenant or when I do my work in tenant organizing, a lot of what I talked to people was about repair issues. And I would simply go up to their door and say, hello, sir, I'm Rui. I'm with Basta. We help tenants out. I've been hearing that there's been a lot of repair issues in this apartment complex. Could you tell me about that? And people will tell you everything that's wrong. And then we can turn that into a specific campaign with demands. So that might be, for instance, in a statewide Louisiana chapter, we need to get rid of this monopoly that doesn't help people. We need to make it so that it's owned by working people in elections that can be, contested, right? And we want those people to be guided by a set of principles that they need to follow. Now, I'm going too long, so that's just an example. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Rui. I'm going to sneak one more question in. This one's for John, and then we'll transition to closing statements. John, how do we strengthen a just transition model that broadly appeals to the working class who are currently working in oil and gas industries? And where does labor fit into the just transition?
This is perfect because as we've been, like since we've been in the community, especially since my YDSAers are like, yeah, we need to set up in places and go talk to people and be out here. So I've been out there with them, and they ran into this exact question because, with the place that I finished high school at, like my entire family and all my old friends, they either work on an oil plant, they either work on offshore rigs, oil plant, or they go to the salt mine. That's it. So, like when I talk to them about it, I'm like, yeah, this is where my family is from. This is where my people are from. And I'm not talking about this in a way in which capitalism destroys jobs and prevents people and leaves people out to dry or hurts workers while capitalists continue to thrive. It's more so in a sense of, hey, well, you do welding. We need people to weld. We need people to weld and do this manual labor. Use your skilled labor for these other things. We can help create path lines to do a just transition, right? Like that's supposed to be part of it, right? Because capitalism will destroy industries, destroy jobs, and which is a heavy part of the out migration from states like Louisiana, Mississippi, and other places like that, is those industries got destroyed, like lumber, logging, coal mining in Appalachia, other things like that, right? There was no just transition for them. So one of the key things is when we talk to people about it, and when I talk to people about it, I present it not as, hey, we want to like make sure that these people can't feed their families, all in favor of this. No, we want something that is sustainable socially and sustainable ecologically. So we want systems that do not destroy our planet, and we also want these people to be able to survive. Of course, like ultimately we would love for a world where every worker where everybody is taken care of, but like we're not there yet. But in the meantime, we can say that, yeah, if you have these skills, if you have these particular skills, we want to make sure that you can still apply those skills in a way that is good for you and can allow you to support yourself. And this has been very effective in communicating that to them, because a lot of the time when they hear about Green New Deal or anything else like that, their mind immediately jumps to the destruction of jobs, people being homeless, or people who are hardworking being left out. And as soon as I literally last 7 days, 2 or 3 conversations, different folks, like it completely changed their minds, and they had to think about it and they left.
That's awesome. Thank you, John. Well, we are just about at time, so we've got just time for everyone to give about 30 seconds to a minute for a closing statement. So Ashley, why don't we start with you?
Okay, thanks. Well, it's been extremely exciting and a huge honor to be part of this panel. The work that my fellow panelists have been doing is just really inspiring. So thank you all for all that you've done. It's been great sharing this platform with you. In terms of a closing statement, we definitely need to fight on a national scale. We've been talking about the need and the kind of potential of new energy forms to be decentralized and democratic. And another thing I would throw in is also kind of digital, and how digitalization is making resources easier to control, and how there is a democratic potential in that. It's not just surveillance capitalism. But the challenge of renewable energy is that it's intermittent, right? So we need storage sources, and we need these systems to be geographically extensive, right? So we can get energy from places where the wind blows a lot and where the sun shines a lot, to places where it's nighttime, or where the resources aren't so strong. So we need to think about a national grid. But we also need to think about 2 other things, and that is justice, right? Because not everybody can afford storage resources. Not everybody can afford these new technologies. So this is another reason to think about not simply relying on mutual aid resources within particular communities, but really tackling corporate power and tackling the capitalist system, and trying to make inroads on various different political levels. It's likely that it's going to be very challenging on a federal scale in the near future, with all of the efforts to deepen fascism in this country that we are seeing playing out right now. So, we may have to do what we can on a local scale for the time being, but we shouldn't give up the fight. And I think we should all take the long view that we're in this for the long haul, and we are going to continue to fight for the kind of democratic, just, and socialist country and communities that we want to see. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ashley. Rui, would you like to close out?
Yes, thank you everyone for coming. Thanks to all the panelists. If you're not in DSA, join DSA. If you are in DSA, get involved, do stuff. And yeah, the struggle is going to be, in some ways longer than we hope and shorter than I think we pessimistically imagine. As Lennon said, in some weeks, decades happen, in some decades, weeks happen, right? So let's keep an open mind. Let's look for the sites of struggle and let's keep pushing. We have a world to win.
Thank you, Rui. John, any last thoughts?
Yeah, main thing I want to say is just that I think that there are ways that we can kind of connect all of these different dots together. And I think that's our number one job as socialists or communists, just general anti-capitalists, is to try to find ways to connect these dots and try to find ways to connect them for other people so that way they make sense. And I think as long as we keep doing that, we'll be moving in the right path.
Thank you. Gumbo, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to Jesse here who invited me and John to this chat because he knew about our work in Louisiana. Shout out again to David and to Jacob from Louisiana Tech because I'm still kicking ass in the Bible Belt. And I just thank you in general for hosting this. I wrote that line yesterday about, Louisiana's approach to mutual aid being informed by generational knowledge and trauma that nobody's coming to save us. And I started crying because you feel it often when you're from the Gulf Coast. So it's nice to be heard and to be given, alongside more people from Louisiana, a place to speak to this and hopefully build on it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Gumbo. And Mitch, would you like to add anything?
Just briefly, I'd just like to say it's an honor kind of participating with it in this panel, not only with like another working group in my own chapter, but also to hear from comrades at different places in this country. It's a good reminder that we are in a struggle together, and irrespective of some political beliefs that we might have, we have ways to work together, and we do have a world to win. And I think that for me, resiliency work is a way to renew my spirit, and it's a way to renew my resolve to keep fighting, because it can be really easy to disengage and get despondent when you sort of run up against these big structures, this big ship that can't change quickly. And so having an opportunity to tackle small but impactful things, I think is the wellspring of organizing strength. So thank you. Thanks for Serena and Brian and everyone on who like really put in a lot of work to make this thing happen. So.
Well, thank you, everyone. That's all we have for now. Thank you to Serena, who's been posting lots of helpful links in the chat. So before you go, make sure to check those out. There's a link to the calendar for Portland DSA, and we have some meetings coming up that we'd love you to join in on if you can. Thank you so much, Ashley, for coming and speaking with us. Thank you to all of our panelists, Mitch, Rui, John, and Gumbo. This was incredible. Thank you all. And thank you all who came to attend. This was a wonderful event. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day. Solidarity.